Welcome to this introduction of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and its author, Mark Twain. Twain was actually born Samuel Longhorn Clemens in November of 1835 and died April 21st, 1910. He lived to be almost 85, and ironically, these are two times in which Halley's Comet is seen visible within the United States. So, on his birthday, Halley's Comet flew by, and then the next time that it came by was actually on his death on April 21st, 1910. Clemens and Twain is known as essentially the father of American literature. Some folks would look at him as the father of American satire, and essentially one of the most important literary figures within not only American literature but world history as well. Twain's really first foray into publishing was the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. This was done when he was 30 years old. Between his birth and the publication of this in 1865, Twain did a lot of manual work, labor, working on the Mississippi River as a boatman. Really was out in the Wild West in San Francisco for quite some time, working with newspapers, was a journalist, really had an interesting and diverse lifestyle for those first 30 years before he begins to finally settle down. It's important to recognize that during these first 30 years, this is pre-Civil War, and then at the end of the Civil War in 1865 when his first short story is actually published. So much of his growing up, because Huck Finn does deal with slavery, and some folks look at the racial tensions that exist within the books, a lot of his subject matter takes place in this antebellum period of the South prior to the Civil War, but its writing and publication is done after the Civil War takes place. And this can be a little bit of confusion for some folks with reading Huck Finn. It's published in the 1880s, but the time period is much more in the 1840s, 1850s, prior to the Civil War. Some of the major works that Twain is famous for: Old Times on the Mississippi, published in 1875. This details a lot of the events that took place in his life while working on the Mississippi River as a boatman. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer comes next in 1876. One of the most famous, really, children novels, and young adult and adult novels. But one of the most famous works, certainly of the 19th century, and really Sawyer ends up being kind of an iconic figure within America today. Tom Sawyer draws from the experiences that Twain had growing up in Hannibal, Missouri, and it also introduces the character of Huckleberry Finn, which, with the novel that we are reading, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, becomes published in 1885. Tom Sawyer does make appearances within Huck Finn as well. It wouldn't be correct to call Huck Finn a sequel to Tom Sawyer, but there is a little bit of overlap with some characters and events between the two works. Adventures of Huck Finn really do cement Twain's place in American literature. Some folks, such as Ernest Hemingway, have gone so far as to say all of American literature really begins with one book, that being The Adventures of Huck Finn. It's the adventure story. It looks at some serious social issues and dilemmas that are taking place within the country, both before the publication and during the publication of the novel, and you also could say even into the 21st century today, 125 years later. It also really has great examples of characterization, satire, humor. All the things that we like to find in entertainment are within Huck Finn, but also it does, send very serious messages and themes, which we'll be looking at as we work throughout this unit. Twain's literary career starts to kind of come to a close in the 1890s, and unfortunately at this point he begins to really squander away much of his income, of his monies. He really would be a very wealthy man if you were to put his earnings into a more modern sense, multi-millionaire. But a lot of this money really starts to become squandered away, primarily through some poor business investments, especially when it came to modern inventions that Twain really got hooked onto that did not really develop. And also he has a publishing company that ultimately ends up failing after initial positive results that it had. A lot of the money begins to become squandered from there as well. He is able to kind of rebound later on in his life through his lecturing tours and some still, some publications, newspaper writing and whatnot later on in his life, but really never had the height of income that would have been expected for such a prolific writer. Beginning in the 1890s, and it's probably no coincidence that this is when his financial troubles begin, Twain does start to suffer from bouts of depression, and really he is going in and out of this depression from the 1890s until his death in 1910. Some things that certainly would add on to this depression would be the death of his wife in 1904, and then also Twain does outlive 3 of his 4 children. Children are dying of meningitis and diseases such as that are rather typical at the beginning of the 20th century. And so he really gets a lot of hard luck deaths within his family, one after the other. So this, along with financial insecurities that he has, certainly is going to add to the elements and bouts of depression that he suffers from. While Huck Finn is regarded as one of the best pieces of American literature, a staple of curriculums across the country with high schools, English courses, there's also a lot of controversy surrounding the book, and that's something that we're going to look at in Lesson 2 of this unit. But it really begins right from the very beginning in 1885, when the Concord, Massachusetts Library immediately bans the book from being on the shelves. The reasons behind the stated reasons behind this is the language of Huck Finn is at the forefront of the controversy. The use of the N-word is prevalent throughout the whole entire book, and many folks look at it as having a racist plot. This last part becomes rather interesting because one of the main leading fights against the book, spurring the controversy, is this racist plot. Yet people who really enjoy the book and defend the book look at Mark Twain as denouncing racism within the book. So it'll be interesting as we read this which side of that argument you see to be a little bit more apparent than the other. The next book that we're going to be reading for this course is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, a critically acclaimed African-American writer. And Ralph Ellison goes so far as to say that Huckleberry Finn knew, as Mark Twain, that Jim, African-American character within the book, was not only a slave but a human being and a symbol of humanity. And in freeing Jim, Huck makes a bid to free himself of the conventionalized evil, meaning slavery, taken for civilization by the town. So one of the leading African-American writers of the 20th century really looks at this book and Huckleberry Finn as being characters that are able to change and grow and mature, and see Jim as a real character, a real human being throughout this book. And that's an interesting thing that we'll look at, because in a lot of renditions, and especially the illustrations of the book, Jim, one of the main characters, and you could argue the main character of the book, is really characterized or caricatured more than characterized as being an actual person. But Ellison would be an example of a respected literary critic who does see that Twain is really fighting racism and the Jim Crow laws of the South within this book, not somebody who is supporting it. Upon completion of Huck Finn, Southern blacks had been granted citizenship for 15 years, but government programs had failed to bring whites and blacks together. The Jim Crow laws really ended up polarizing the races even more, and with the legalization of segregation, with the Jim Crow laws, it really led to further alienation and disenfranchisement. Lynchings are going on continually throughout the South, really from the 1880s into the 1950s even. And so when this book is being written, many of these problems are really starting to come to the height. And it's important to realize, again, that Twain is writing about events 30, 40 years before this, from the 1880s, not that he writes it in the 1840s or 50s. But while he is writing it, certainly this polarization between whites and blacks is taking place, and so the racism topic and theme of the book would be very pertinent for the day. Jim is one of the main characters. Him and Huck Finn are the two main characters throughout the book. And it's interesting, when reading it, you can either look at Huck as being the main character himself, which would make sense with the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as the title, or an argument could be made that Jim is actually the main character of the book. many folks have a tough time really deciding on the characterization of Jim because he is such a stereotyped character with his slave dialect, strong beliefs in superstition, which really end up being kind of typical of the minstrel or blackface characterizations of African Americans that takes place in the 1880s. At the same time, there are some very poignant glimpses of humanity that are displayed by Jim throughout the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So keep an open eye for the humanity displayed by white characters throughout the text, and then compare their form of humanity to that of Jim that takes place, and you'll probably see that Jim does rise from the stereotypical stock black minstrel character to a very poignant and powerful human being, especially with the relationship that he builds with Huckleberry Finn throughout the text. Something for you also to consider is how does this juxtaposition of Jim the minstrel and Jim the human correlate with the rest of American society during the 19th century, and certainly not just the 19th century, but the 20th century and the 21st century today. And this is going to be a question that we're really investigating, not just in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn lessons for this unit, but also Invisible Man as well. So hopefully you're able to gain some insight into these thoughts while you're reading the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Pay close attention to the actions of Jim, compare his viewpoints and his moments of humanity, and compare those with the rest of the characters throughout the book. And it'll be interesting to really see what viewpoints you were able to come up with your beliefs about the book in general. So looking forward to hearing your responses.